We are very pleased to welcome John Perkins tonight. He will be speaking, and he will also be taking some questions from the floor after he finishes his presentation. Mr. John Perkins. John Perkins.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Dave. Thank you. I'd like to start by saying why, from an economic hitman's perspective, I think we're at war. Why we're doing what we're doing in the Middle East today, in Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, in Kuwait, and all over. Why this is happening, and by understanding that, how we must end it. You know, we see all these signs about getting rid of George Bush, but we all, I think, know that George Bush isn't really the problem. George Bush is certainly part of the problem, but this thing goes deeper than Democrats or Republicans. You know, we have to remember that it was John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson who really took us into Vietnam. They were Democrats. It's the corporatocracy. It's the people that run our big corporations. And so we'll be talking a little bit about that tonight to really try to get at the heart of this problem. And I'm not trying to forgive George Bush. I mean, I'm as upset as anybody is at what's going on today in this country. But to just think that will do away with the problem by voting in somebody else isn't going to solve the problem. We've got to go deeper than that. And tonight, we're going to do that. I have a very strong conviction that when we leave here tonight, all of us, together we will be determined, you and I, to go out and do the right thing. And it's the pragmatic thing, it's the rational thing, and it's the patriotic thing. And we're going to turn this country around, we're going to turn the world around in that process, and we're going to create a world that my 24-year-old daughter and her children will be very happy to inherit. And that means that every child growing up today and in the future in Nigeria and in Indonesia and in the Philippines and in Iraq and in Bolivia and Ecuador and Mexico also will be happy about what's going to happen here tonight. The movement that we're going to get going on to change this country, because I believe that it's not that difficult. It's a challenge, but we're going to move forward with it. Before we get into that, though, I would just like to talk a little bit about, from my perspective as an economic hitman, what's really been going on in the history of this world in my lifetime, which really began at the end of World War II. I was born just before World War II ended in 1945. My dad was in the Navy at the time. He didn't see me until I was a year old because of World War II, because he was serving in the Navy. I didn't see him either till I was a year old. I don't remember that occasion, but he tells me he does. From my perspective, what we've been doing since the end of World War II is building an empire. And today we have managed to build the world's first truly global empire. It's the first in the history of the world. And it's also the first empire that's really been built without the military for the most part. It's been built through economics, through economic hitmen like me. The military has been there standing in the background, prepared to go in to serve us, to take care of things when we failed. But it's been essentially built through economics. And in the process of building this empire, let me go back. This empire is the first truly global one. We're unchallenged by any other superpower. We're challenged today by men and women with homemade bombs on their backs, but we're not challenged by any other empire today. And it's the first empire that hasn't been built primarily by the military. It's also the first empire without an emperor. And again, some of you may dispute that. you strong Democrats out there. But the fact of the matter is, instead of an empire, what we have today, and what's been growing stronger and stronger since World War II, is what I call the corporatocracy. And this is a fairly small group of mostly men who run our biggest corporations. And through them, they run our government and practically every other government in the world, all the important ones in the world. They are the equivalent of the empire. And they are in control regardless of whether we have a Republican or a Democrat in the White House or controlling Congress. They are in control. Certain things may be different with a Republican and a Democrat. For example, the Supreme Court, people that are put on that. There's differences. But as far as building this empire is concerned, it continues under all those regimes. And this is what we must change. And so how do we economic hitmen work? Well, the most common way, and Dave just read a bit of that, is that we will identify a country, a third world country, that has resources that our corporations covet, like oil. And then we'll arrange a huge loan to that country from an organization like the World Bank. But this loan doesn't go to the country. Instead, it goes to U.S. corporations. Halliburton, Bechtel, Brown and Root, you know the names. Those are the ones that get the money. And they build big infrastructure projects in this country. Power plants, ports, highways, industrial parks, things that benefit the very rich who are in collaboration with the corporatocracy, but they don't benefit the poor. The poor aren't connected to the power grids. They don't have the skills to get the jobs in the industrial parks. They don't own cars to drive on the highways or ships to use in the ports. The country's left holding a huge debt, so huge you can't possibly repay it. So at some time, we economic hitmen go back and say to the country, listen, you can't pay your debts, so give us a pound of flesh. Sell oil to our oil companies real cheap, or vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq. And in that way, we've built this empire. There's a lot of other things we've done, but that's the most common and most typical one. Sometimes we fail, not very often. I failed miserably in Panama with Omar Torrijos, I personally, and in Ecuador with Jaime Roldos. And I detail this in the books, but what happens then is what we call the jackals go in. The jackals overthrow governments, as we tried to do in 2002 with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, or they assassinate the leaders of these governments, as they did with Jaime Roldos in Ecuador and Omar Torrijos in Panama. I felt deeply guilty for that, because I particularly liked Torrijos, who I knew quite well personally. And I knew that if I failed to bring him around, the jackals were likely to step in, and they did. He died in a fiery airplane crash, and I have no doubt it was a CIA-orchestrated assassination done by jackals. On the few occasions when the jackals also fail, then, and only then, does the military go in. That's what happened in Iraq. To understand Iraq, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my perspective on Iraq in just a minute, but to really understand it, we first have to understand Saudi Arabia. A lot of you will remember, some of you won't. I'd like to see we get quite a generational mix here. In the early 70s, OPEC didn't like what we were doing in Israel. Same old story. And so they cut off our oil supplies. So some of you will remember these long lines at the gas stations. And we feared we were going to have another depression like the 1929 depression. And so the U.S. Treasury Department came to me and other economic hitmen and said, listen, you know, we can't allow OPEC to blackmail us anymore. You guys got to come up with a plan so this will never happen again. We knew that that plan had to involve Saudi Arabia because it had more oil than anybody else, and it also, the House of Saud, the royal family, was corrupt and corruptible. The long version is explained in the book, but the short version of what we did, the deal we finally struck with the House of Saud, was a deal whereby they would return almost all the money they made from selling oil to the United States, invested in U.S. government securities. The U.S. Treasury Department would use the interest from those securities, which over the years has amounted to trillions of dollars, to hire U.S. companies to westernize Saudi Arabia, build petrochemical complexes, desalination plants, whole cities out of the desert, McDonald's and all the other things that go along with our Western culture. The House of Saud would also agree to keep the price of oil within limits acceptable to the oil companies, possibly not acceptable to you and me, but acceptable to the oil companies. And this is very, very important. They agreed that they would never, ever sell oil for anything other than US dollars. This happened in the early 70s, right after we'd gone off the gold standard because we were bankrupt, because we could not pay off our debts to European countries in gold. Nixon took us off the gold standard. And then we were stuck with a situation as, why will anybody in the world use dollars? So very shortly we came up with this plan, which in essence put the dollar on the oil standard. You cannot buy oil on the world market for anything other than dollars, and that's very important to the corporatocracy. Our part of the bargain was we agreed to keep the House of Saud in power, in control. It was an amazing deal, the deal of the century. It was history-making, incredibly powerful deal that we struck with Saudi Arabia. And it's held. It's had some what the CIA calls blowback, unintended consequences. For example, one of the things that really pisses Osama bin Laden off is those McDonald's and those desalinization plants and those petrochemical complexes surrounding Medina and Mecca, the two most sacred sites in Islam. And it pisses off a lot of other Muslims in Indonesia and all over the world. There's been some blowback, but on the whole, the corporatocracy looked at this as an incredible success. I had done my job. We economic hitmen did a great job with that one. So we decided that Saddam Hussein ought to accept something very similar. Now, probably a lot of you know that Saddam has been our boy for a very, very long time. You may remember Abdul Karim Qasim, who was president of Iraq in the early 60s. Qasim came up with a unique concept. He said, Iraqi oil ought to go to benefit the Iraqi people. How novel is that? But we didn't like that very much. He began to tax the oil companies, particularly the British and some American companies, and threatened to nationalize our oil companies. And so we decided that Qasim had to go. The CIA sent an assassination team. It was headed by a man who was still going through high school, an Iraqi citizen who was still going through high school. They riddled Qasim's car with bullets on the streets of Baghdad and missed him. The head of this assassination team was wounded and fled to Syria. His name was Saddam Hussein. He was a CIA agent in those days, an assassin for us. He failed. And so the CIA went directly, and this is all history, I'm not creating this. CIA went in and had Qasim publicly executed on Iraqi television. They put Saddam's cousin in charge. He became president of Iraq, and Saddam became vice president in charge of security. Eventually, as you know, he became president. He was our boy. He was our man. And so, and we sold him a lot of, and gave him a lot of tanks. We built him, Bechtel built him big chemical, I ought to know, my father-in-law was chief architect at Bechtel, built Saddam big chemical plants that were used, and we knew that they were used to make mustard gas and other chemical weapons that were being employed against the Kurds and later the Iranians. We knew this, but we sold him these things. And in the 1980s, we decided that Saddam Hussein ought to accept something similar to Saudi Arabia. It was such a successful deal, because after all, what we want to do is control the Middle East and control the oil in the Middle East. And incidentally, I'm going to get back to Iraq in just a moment. But for those of you who think